So here you're going to see me go through the entire process of drawing a figure. Now, figure drawing is comprised of a number of different kinds of skills, from gesture to measuring in proportion, light logic, and each one of these skills individually, I would encourage you to really study and get a sense of what they are on their own. But in order to do a finished figure drawing, we need to find a way to bring all of these different skills together, and that's what you're going to see here today, going through the entire process, beginning with a very dynamic light gesture to a finished and rendered figure drawing. So before we get into the figure drawing process, I want to talk just a few minutes about materials and how to choose a good reference. So the very first thing I tend to do when I start a figure drawing is select a well-lit pose. So you can see this photo here is lit from the left and from above. Most of it's in light, but I have some very beautiful shadows, and this is lit from a single light source. Now, I think a drawing really begins with these kinds of decisions, a long time before the pencil actually hits the paper. So the kind of paper that I'm using is a Canson paper, and I love to use these warm colored pieces of paper when I'm doing figure drawing because it allows the drawing to have a sense of warmth to it. I'll also be working with this dark sepia colored pencil. It's a Rembrandt Polycolor pencil from Lyra. And I'm going to be, later on in the process, I'm going to be using a white Derwent pencil to do some of the lights and highlights. When you're ready to draw, you want to start off with what's called a gesture drawing. Now, what a gesture drawing is supposed to do is simplify the pose into its most basic elements. And the idea is we want something that's incredibly dynamic, but also incredibly simple. We don't want to do any sort of detail work. And the idea here is that the drawing is going to go through a series of iterations. So the gesture process is intended to be light, to be fluid, to be dynamic, and above all else to be malleable, because we're going to be moving these things around quite a bit. No artist gets it right the very first time, so we need this section of the process to be able to just put something down on the page that we can move around, alter, and edit. So let's take a look at the reference photo here. The kinds of information I'm looking for in a gesture drawing are to really establish the distances and directions the various forms of the body are going. So we have the arms traveling in this direction, the torso overall tilted this way, and then this front leg coming down in this direction. So the first line you'll see is going to simplify all of this into one big movement across the page. So it's important to note at this stage that I'm not really even drawing the figure. I'm really placing in the direction of the forms of the body and really the placement of where these forms are going to go. And again, you'll notice here that I'm using incredibly light and soft lines. I would say that the longer the drawing is you're going to do, the lighter you should try and begin at the beginning, because the more iterations your drawing is probably going to go through. So once I've established these big forms, what I want to do is start to place in a couple of the smaller forms as well. Now, it's okay if this gesture drawing doesn't look too much like a figure. That's totally fine. Again, we have plenty of time to flesh it all out later on. But I simply want to get some kind of starting point that I'll build from later on. So at the beginning, we want the gesture to be incredibly simple because what we're going to do now is introduce the measuring process. And the idea here is if we go too far in this section of the drawing, we're less likely to move things when we measure them and find out that certain things aren't in the right place. So let's go ahead and introduce the measuring process. Once I've got a very simple gesture down on the page, I'm going to start to introduce some measuring. Now, the reason is a figure drawing should be dynamic and exciting, but we also need it to be accurate. So the gesture and measuring stages are two very different stages. While the gesture part of the drawing emphasizes direction, dynamism, simplicity, the measuring portion is a much more technical process that's going to allow us to make sure that all of the pieces in the drawing are in an accurate proportion to one another, and of course, they really reflect the true proportions of the model. So I tend to use a few different kinds of measuring techniques when I draw. First, I'm going to use a technique called angle sighting, where you're going to see me extract an angle from a reference photo and literally pull it over to the drawing that I'm working on. I'm also going to be using proportional measuring, where I'm actually going to take the proportion of something on the model and see how it relates to the sizes of other things on the model. And finally, I'm going to use what are called plumb lines. So I'm going to select a point on the model, say up near the top, and I'm going to extend an imaginary vertical line down to see what kind of information lines up. So some of the first pieces of information I want to get while I'm measuring are things like the big relationship. So I'm going to select the wrist, the knee, and the shoulder here, and I want to see what this triangular relationship is. And to do that, I'm going to use angle sighting. So while I'm drawing, or while I'm measuring, I need to actually select a specific point just to really solidify it. So right up here on the shoulder, you can see there's this lovely moment where we have the shoulder kind of disappear into some of the construction on the back, and we can see this lovely angle where the shadow comes in. Now, the first part of your measuring process, you just get to proclaim that it is accurate, because so far it's not in relationship to anything else. So what you're going to see me do is I'm going to darken this up just a little bit, and what this is going to tell me is that this little section here is a stand-in for this little shadow place here. So I'm making that a little more solid. Now, every new point on the model that I'm trying to get, I need to draw in relationship to this point here. So everything is going to go back to that. So what that means is that I'm going to select a single point, and I just need to get that single point oriented first. Now, almost all of the points you're going to see me make have some kind of skeletal foundation. So where that shadow occurs is actually pretty near the acromion process of the scapula. The point on the knee I'm going to make is going to be related to the patella, and of course we have the bones on the wrist, the radius at the top of the wrist here that I'm going to be going for. So it's not important that you know all of these names, but it is important that you choose landmarks that are going to be really firm. And the reason I like skeletal landmarks for measuring is because the skeleton forms this rigid foundation of the body. And if we can establish the skeletal proportions, we'll have a little more wiggle room when we get to some of the flesh and the contours a little later on. So what you're going to see me do here is, again, extract an angle from the model, starting at that location where we just solidified in the drawing, and heading down toward the radius of the wrist. And what I'm going to do is pull that angle over to my drawing to compare it. And what this gives me is a single line, and I know somewhere on that line is the proper location of the radius. Now, what happens at this stage is that no matter where I put the radius on this line, it's going to be correct, but it's going to establish the scale. So for example, if I put the radius here, I would have a very small drawing. If I put the radius all the way out here, it would increase the scale considerably. So I want to make sure that I'm going to have enough room later on to draw the rest of the figure. So I'm going to place the radius right about here. Now again, what I tend to do is once I place something, I want to draw just enough context to make sure that I know what it is and I can come back to it, but not so much where if I need to move it again, which is very likely, that I'll have put a lot of time into it. So once I have these 2 points solidified, then I need to go find a third point down here. So this third point I'm going to find by triangulating the angle between them. So starting off with my original point up here, again, I'm going to hold my pencil so that it is going through our original point and the point that I'm trying to figure out. And it's almost vertical, but it is just slightly to the left. And I'm going to pull that angle over here. I'm going to make a little mark where that goes. Now, I always like to measure the same place multiple times to make sure that I am really getting the proper angle. So for example, this time I'm getting it a little further over. It's important to note that we as humans are not perfect or ideal measuring tools. So getting some things inaccurate is going to be inevitable, but we at least want it to be believable. So what I can do here is now extend a line down, and I know somewhere on this line is going to be the location of the knee. Now, unlike before where I just got to select it, now that we have one relationship established, it's really important that I make sure that the knee works in relationship to both of these points. So I'm going to triangulate it. So I'm going to go over to the radius, put my pencil through that point as well as the same point on the knee that I've been working with. And again, I'm going to transfer this angle over. So once I've got these 3 points all measured out and I'm confident that the measurements on my drawing reflect the actual measurements from the model, I need to retrofit my gesture just a little bit. Now, one of the common questions I get is, why not start with a measuring process instead of doing a gesture first? Now, what I usually tell students is that there's no right process to go through, and ultimately, you will hopefully figure out your own process that works for you. But the reason that I start off with the gesture first is that I think it's more important to have a drawing that is dynamic and interesting rather than one that is perfectly accurate. And in fact, as the process goes on, you're actually going to see me slightly deviate from the model by exaggerating certain things to actually increase the level of dynamism. So we as artists are not always just tied to what we can observe. We should take some creative and expressive license while constructing the figure. And the figure is so interesting because it is a perfect blend of a very specific form with very particular proportions, but it's also incredibly expressive. So what I'm going to do now, again, is retrofit my gesture just a little bit to reflect the new information that I've gotten. So while I'm drawing, how I decide when I need to measure or not is, for instance, let's say I want to figure out where this elbow is here. Now, if I'm comfortable just figuring it out by sight, I feel like I have enough information, then I can simply just place the elbow. But if I'm drawing somewhere and saying down here, and I'm really not confident where the bottom of the foot is, this is an opportunity to measure. Now, there's no right amount of times you should measure. Really, you just want to get to the point where you're comfortable drawing. But again, my rule of thumb is the longer the drawing, the more you want to spend time measuring, because if you have wild inaccuracies in a much longer drawing, you've got to live with those inaccuracies much longer. So what you're going to see me do now is go back and forth through the gesture and measuring process, getting a new measurement for a piece of information that I need, but then measuring again to keep my drawing in proper proportion. So what I'm doing now is I'm establishing some secondary and tertiary points. And again, because I'm spending longer on this drawing, I really want to make sure that certain elements are in proportion. So I'm going to find things like the points we talked about previously. I am going to locate the anterior superior iliac spine of the pelvis. I'm going to locate the olecranon process of the elbow. Yeah, I think those two are going to be critical. And I'm going to locate the tip of the big toe as well as probably the fibula at the ankle. So I'm just going to take some time to go ahead and angle sight those. So the question I'm asking myself is, what is the essential information that I need to feel comfortable completing this drawing and knowing that it's in accurate proportion? So you know, the reason I'm selecting these particular points, again, they're all skeletal, but also they are the kind of big pieces that I feel are really critical to my understanding of the drawing. So here you see me again getting the pelvis in, and I'm making a little mark that when I come back to it, it'll jog my memory as that shadow. So I'm walking a fine line here between giving enough information that I can remember what I've drawn, so I don't have to keep it all in my head, because if you just put a point right there, you're likely to come back later and say, wait, where was that thing that I was measuring? So I feel just enough information is great, because that way I don't have to burden my memory with it. Like I said, I'm big on measuring multiple times. So you can see that this process does take quite a bit longer when we're going for accuracy, but again, I think it's really important. Those of you who remember woodshop will remember that old phrase, measure twice, cut once. And so you'll see me measuring the same things I have measured before. And again, that's just a safety precaution, essentially, to make sure everything is in proper proportion. I am taking as many measurements as I can off of these two original points. And the reason is because I'm a human and a very fallible measuring machine. This is always going to be the most accurate. Anything I base off of these two is going to get less accurate. So you'll say I only will take a measurement off of like this point down here if I have to, because that is by definition, every one of these is a little inaccurate. Those inaccuracies tend to build quite a bit over time. So to get the big toe, I have to take a measurement off here to relate it back. But again, I am aware that this is a dicey measuring move, but it's the point that makes the most sense. So now I'm going back up to this point and I'm going to triangulate the tip of the big toe. The way I look at the measuring process is this is really making an investment in this drawing. So it is much better to figure out this information now than to spend an hour rendering and realize that a leg is too long or something is really out of proportion. Because your only option at that point is to erase. So now that I've established some points through angle sighting, I'm going to introduce some proportional measuring. Now, even though I'm switching measuring techniques, if I've done this correctly, all of the information should be mutually supporting. So what I'm going to do is take a measurement from the tip of the big toe to our spot on the patella here. And when I do proportional measuring, again, I'm going to just get the proportion on my pencil. So the tip of the pencil here is going to line up from my point of view with that shadow. And my thumb, I'm going to use as a slide rule and I'm going to put my thumb right where the big toe is. Once I've got that proportion, I'm going to pull it up and see where it should meet on the figure. So I'm getting it hits right about there. So what this tells me then is, and that's right about there on my drawing, that this distance should be the same as this distance. So let's see if it is. Beautiful. Okay, so that's what you want. You want your separate measuring processes to be mutually supporting. So even though I did this by different processes, all of the information comes together there. So once again, what you're going to see me do now is go back to the gesture process. And again, I really would rather the drawing be more dynamic than accurate. So I'm just going to gesture in a few more elements. So again, whenever I add something new, you'll see my pencil do this a lot. And what that's doing is I'm trying never to just guess where something is by following my pencil down. I'm always going to be comparing it to things that I've placed previously. So when I'm trying to get, say, this little dimple here between the olecranon process and the medial epicondyle of the elbow, I'm again comparing it back to this spot and this spot. And now that I've got that, I can establish the underside of the arm, get in a little bit of the wrist, and now again I can start to feel comfortable, again going back to the gesture process just a little more. And the gesture process, again, you'll notice that my pencil is moving completely differently than it was when I was measuring. And again, the reason there is that the gesture process should be more fluid, more dynamic. And again, we're kind of letting go of the need to be hyper accurate at this stage and really instead focusing in on creating something that is, again, beautiful and fluid. But you can always go back to the measuring stage. And again, how I decide to go back and measure is, say again, I'm working on something like the head. If I don't know how big it is, instead of guessing, I can measure the head, see how that measurement is going to compare against something else I've already drawn, and figure out what the relationship is going to be. So for example, what I've done here is taken the measurement for the head, and I've gone all the way to the tip of the model's bun. Once I have that proportion, I'm just kind of moving it around to see if I can find a happy accident, to see if there is anything I've previously drawn that is exactly the same proportion or close to it. And what I've learned is that the distance from the olecranon process of the elbow to the radius is about the same distance as from the tip of the bun to where we see the head appear here. So what I can do is, again, take this distance and apply it up to see where the tip of that bun is going to be. And again, I'm going to make a little mark. So the measuring process does take quite a bit of time, and again, it really slows the process down. But I would heavily encourage you to take the time it takes to really measure out your figures, because again, the more accurate they are, the more you're going to avoid the possibility of needing to erase more rendered drawings later on. So once you have a dynamic gesture that's been brought into proportion by measuring techniques, you're ready to start constructing volume. So now I'm going to start the process of fleshing out the figure. How I like to think about this process is that I'm always translating complex forms of the body into basic understandable volumes like cylinders and ovoids. This part of the process should feel a little more fluid and dynamic because, again, we want the final drawing to be exciting and dynamic and have a lot of movement to it. And how we get that is by drawing quickly and dynamically. You don't want to draw so fast where it compromises the quality of the drawing, but at the same time, drawing a little quickly is a wonderful way to add a good amount of dynamism to your drawing. Now, one of the things you're going to note is that I'm going to continue to include measuring in my process. And again, the reason is that every new form I'm going to draw does have a proportion that it should match up with the rest of the drawing. So the final process of drawing in this sense ends up becoming an improvisation of all of these different techniques. So it's not a step-by-step process in the sense that once you've done measuring, you're done with it. Or once you've done some gesturing, then you can completely move on. We're always going to be revisiting these techniques as needed. This is one of the reasons why I often tell people that the figure drawing process is not a simple step-by-step process. It's depending on the pose, depending on what you're seeing of the model, depending on the body style of the model, there are all kinds of things that can change up how you employ these various strategies of figure drawing. So again, here you can see that first the leg is this simple sort of oval kind of shape. And what we're going to do is I want to look for evidence of cross contour lines coming up. Now, cross contour lines on the form are lines that aren't around the actual contour edge, but they come up and over. And I want to find as many of those as I can. So for example, take a look right here. This is subtle, but we can actually see this line, this contour line in the back of the leg coming up, in, and then over and meeting up with the bathing suit right here. So again, it's a little subtle, but I actually want to include some of that information, again, coming up and over. Now, this is a signal to the brain that this form is essentially cylindrical. Now, look right here. We can see just a hint of an indication right here. And again, this is incredibly subtle, But every time I can get in an ellipse of a cylinder is going to help the brain see these as volumetric. So when I come up here to the arm, I can see the deltoid as a bit of an ovoid shape. I can see the upper section of the arm as a cylinder. So at every point, I'm trying to think about these forms as volumes. And again, this is a very different kind of thought process than simply thinking about them as contour shapes. So one thing that we want to think about when we're drawing is, of course, focus. So we don't need to fill out every aspect of the drawing in its entirety. So you're going to see me take this back leg here, and even though it is just as in focus as anything else in our reference photo, that doesn't mean that I need to focus on it in the drawing. So what I'm going to do is just give a simple indication, but I'm really going to let it fade out. And this will allow that back leg to appear to drop behind in the picture plane. Now again, this isn't because I'm seeing this form, but I can make a decision as an artist to start to drop certain elements back. So now I'm going to go to the torso, and I really want to, again, get a good sense of volume. So because the model is wearing a bathing suit here, we can actually use that bathing suit as an indicator of volume. So for example, you'll note that the line here indicates that there is an ellipse there that we are looking down into. We are above it, looking down into it. So I'm going to place that line there. And I'm also going to take a look at the center line here. So we can see the navel here, and notice that the center line, which is of course a longitude line going up the volume of the torso, it's much closer to the left side of the body than it is to the right side of the body. So again, when I'm putting in the center line, that is also going to help give a sense of volume. So again, it's going to be a longitude line running up. And notice that when we place in that center line, suddenly now we can tell that the body is turned, that we're seeing more of this side of the torso than the front. So when we get down to the leg here, again, we want to think about it as a cylindrical form that is traveling down. So again, we can, I'm not seeing too many actual indications of ellipses, but oftentimes I will kind of ghost them in just a little bit for two reasons. A, it keeps my mind thinking about all of these forms as volumes, and B, again, these indications of ellipses operate on a subliminal level with your viewers that tell them what volume and what direction the volumes are heading in. So I'm going to flesh out the hand just a little bit. For the thumb, I'm going to use a hint of for the pad of muscle here that is at the base of the thumb, I'm going to use a little ovoid. And again, I'm going to keep the hands pretty simple for now. For the head, which I've already figured out the basic proportion of, I'm going to use a basic ovoid shape. And again, you'll note that every new step of the drawing, I'm going to draw just a little more lightly. So again, I have these subtle volumetric indications. I also want to note where the head actually intersects with the arm. So you can see this was my first guess here, but now that I'm looking, I think it needs to be back a little bit further. Now, if I really wanted to figure this out, I could even angle sight from that part on the elbow. Again, you can decide to do however much measuring you want. So I'm going to pull this back a little bit. One of the reasons we spend so much time measuring the human figure is because your viewer has a built-in sense of proportion in the mind. So if you think about this, if the model's leg was 2 inches longer on one side than the other, you'd probably notice it. So again, we as humans are more critical about artwork that has humans in it than we are of other kinds of artwork. So again, making sure your figures are in proportion is really important. So you can start to see now the figure is not just a series of points, but it's actually starting to become fleshed out as a volume. So this is a wonderful way to, again, take it from a series of simple points and a gesture into something that really starts to read as a solid figure appearing on the page. Once you've got a dynamic gesture that's been brought into proportion by using a series of measuring techniques, and you've used basic volumes to start to flesh out the body, you're ready to start building up the form through line quality. Now, it's important to note that at this stage, I haven't drawn any lines that are intended to be seen by a viewer. Everything so far has simply been a construction process for me to lay a foundation, but now I want to start actually drawing lines to be seen by a viewer. Now, it's important to note here as well that if I were drawing alone in my studio, I actually would be drawing much lighter than this in this stage of the process, as again, I don't want any of this to be seen by a viewer. So once I'm ready to start making lines to be seen by a viewer, I want to think about a line quality as really a form of communication. Whenever you are drawing a line that is intended to be seen by a viewer, you're communicating with the viewer. And the metaphor that I like to use here is that line quality is similar to tone of voice. When we use our voices, we raise the volume, we lower volume, we can sound angry, happy, joyous. And although it's not a direct metaphor for line quality, what we want to do with our line quality is always take the opportunity to communicate something to the viewer. Now, imagine if I was talking in a monotone, how unexciting that would be. And that's what we want to avoid in our drawing here. We want to use lines that are going to stimulate and excite the viewer. So we never want to do a drawing that has a uniform kind of line quality. So there are many ways to think about line quality, and I'm going to talk about some of the different strategies that I use. So one way to think about line quality is through a tactile kind of sensation. So for example, if I want to make this knee here, if I want to indicate that there is a bone under there, I might use a harder, more angular line. But as it goes up, if I want to communicate that it's softer and fleshier as it travels up, I might use a softer line. So you can see that the line quality is changing as it goes from the harder section near the bone to the fleshier section up near the top. So up here, if near the shoulder, again, if I want to communicate the hardness of a bone that's back here, but again transition into the muscle of the shoulder, I will change the line quality. So you can think about line quality as, again, trying to communicate what it might be like to touch these different aspects of the figure. Now, in addition to that tactile kind of sensation, you can also think about using line quality for emphasis. So for example, if I want a certain part of the figure to stand out more or to appear closer, I might use line qualities that are a little darker, as that is going to allow the eye to be pulled over to that section of the figure, as well as make that part of the drawing stand out. And again, you'll see that when I darken up certain pieces of the line, they literally start to appear closer to us than, say, this back leg. Again, if I'm using a really soft kind of line quality, you can see that that allows the line to kind of disappear. So I'm going to start to build up the line quality here. And I often like to start off with these skeletal elements, again, kind of using more angular lines where we have bones, and more soft lines if we have something fleshy, and everywhere in between. So again, what we're really trying to avoid is a monotone with our line quality. We really want to take advantage of as many opportunities as we can to really communicate something to the viewer. Now, one thing I would highly recommend as you're moving around your figure is to avoid the temptation to try and address every aspect of the figure. So you'll note that I'm going to be leaving many aspects of the figure simply untouched. And I really like drawings that have a kind of line quality that is continually disappearing and reappearing. Many beginners, when they start to draw, have almost a fear that if they don't kind of encase the figure in a hard contour, that it'll somehow spill out all over the page. But your viewers are sophisticated. They are perfectly happy to have a line disappear and understand that it's depicting a solid form. So you're going to see many areas of the figure drawing where I'm going to either not even connect the lines or like this. I'll probably leave this line just as is. And in fact, because we have so much light on that part of the figure, I'm actually going to block it out entirely. So again, you want to use as many opportunities as you can and have as many reasons as you can to communicate through line. Now, when we start to build up with line quality like this, we can start to use anatomical features to start to communicate a little more with our viewer. So for example, with this navel here, I'm going to place a nice hard line here, and that's going to start to tell the viewer that there's a bit of value there. And I'm going to use, again, a soft line quality just to pull it out to communicate that there is a soft pillow of flesh right underneath this section here. I can also start to indicate some of the more subtle areas of the anatomy. So for example, the moment where we have, an ankle bone coming up this way, but we have a muscle connection coming out behind it. And particularly over here where we have the ribs, you'll note that I'm just going to use these very soft lines at first just to indicate that we have these anatomical features there. Now when we start to talk about lighting, I'll use much bolder strategies to start to pull up these elements. But at this stage of the drawing, I'm simply, again, indicating where some of these anatomical features are. It's critical to remember that you can always make a line darker, but once the line hits a certain level of darkness, it can be a little difficult to pull back. So I tend to leave myself a little room if I ever want or need to darken up a line quality. So once again here, you'll note that when I'm drawing these kinds of lines, my hand is moving pretty quickly. Also, I'm really trying to pay attention to overlaps. So you can see here we have a series of overlaps both outside and inside the form, where we have one line disappearing behind another. So all of these things are opportunities for you to really explore the wide range of different line qualities that really start to pull the figure together. Now, you'll notice that I'm still being a little hesitant here, and again, the reason is I am not thinking about finishing this process of line quality entirely before moving on to the next steps, but I just want to start to think about it. So again, when we get to the next step of applying values, you'll still see me going back to line quality, and at times even going back to measuring and gesture. So again, this process is very much an improvisation of moving back and forth through all of the different kinds of processes that we've introduced so far. So I'm feeling comfortable at this stage. The figure is starting to solidify a little bit more. I want to make just a couple of other minor changes to our line quality here, but I think I'm ready to start to think about the figure in terms of light and shadow. Before we start shading the figure, I'd like to talk about the process that I'm going to use in reference to a simple object. So I'm just going to first show you the entire shading process in a simple form like this egg. Now, when I think about light and value, I think about it in terms of a 5-step value scale. So I'm going to make a simple value scale right up here. Now, over here, I'm going to put our darkest value, which is going to be our number 5 value. Now, your number 5 value is only really going to show up in the darkest parts of the drawing. Will probably be used pretty sparingly. You'll note that I've actually switched my grip over to the tripod grip here versus what I've been using for the rest of the drawing, which has been the overhand grip. So here we have our number 5 value. Now, I'm using a dark sepia pencil, so this doesn't get quite as dark as black, but this number 5 value you want to think of being the darkest that your material goes. So on the other end of the spectrum, we're going to have our number 1 value. So right here is going to be our brightest value. And again, you'll see that I have my white pencil that I'm going to be using here. And I'm pressing as hard as I can with the white pencil. Now, just like your number 5 value, the white value or the number 1 value will be used very sparingly. So really you'll only see it in the highlights or the very brightest sections of the drawing. So what we need to do now is fill in the rest of our value scale. So right here in the middle, we have roughly our number 3 value. So I'm going to give this just a basic wash here. And the idea is that this number 3 value is right in the middle. Now, one of the things you're going to see happen while I'm shading is I will rarely attempt to drop in the exact right value on my first attempt. I always like to shade just a value or two above what it will eventually be, because it's much easier to get our drawings darker than it is to lighten it once we've gotten to a certain level of darkness. So while we're constructing the value scale is a great opportunity to practice this. So you should expect that you're going to do a good amount of adjustment. So now I'm going to drop in a number 4 value. And you can see here, we can start to get a nice sense of the value scale moving up. Now, I would say that the jump from our number 3 value to our number 2 value isn't quite working yet, because you can see there's a much larger jump between these two. So I'm going to add a little bit of white in this value. So you want to work with the value scale until it seems to be evenly going from one value to the next. And you can see with this value scale, I'm more interested in the values shifting as they go up and a little less interested in exactly how cleanly drawn the value scale is. But so again, we want a nice shift from our number 5 darkest value to our number 1 lighter value here. Now, we could spend quite a bit of time refining this value scale, and I do want to get to the drawing. But again, this is doing a value scale and experimenting is a great way to learn how to draw values consistently well. So many of you may note that other artists tend to use value scales that are much larger. Value scales that go up to 12 is a very common one. And even I've seen people using 20 or more different values. And I found that just thinking in 5 is really enough. So let me put this into practice by drawing a simple egg shape. So I'm going to be working from this reference photograph here. So first I'm just going to get our basic egg shape down on the page. And again, it's a little wider at the back, and it narrows a little as we go toward the front. So you're going to see a very similar process to what I did with the figure, starting with just a really simple light drawing. And I'm going to work my way up to it. So let's talk about how this value scale actually starts to apply to a simple object. So I'd like to note here that there's a very specific moment where we can see the form is in light and then transitions to shadow. This line right here, where the light ends, is referred to as the line of termination, the moment when light terminates. So many people, when they start to shade, end up having these really long gradations, but I hope you can see here that this isn't that long of a gradation. It's actually a pretty quick transition from light to dark. Now, that line of termination is the very first thing you're going to see me put in. So using the side of my pencil, I'm going to draw in the line of termination. And you can see here that I'm trying to get the correct angles of this shadow shape down as well. So everything on the left side of the line of termination in this drawing is going to be in light. Everything on the right side is going to be considered shadow. So the next shape, shadow shape that I want to get is the cast shadow. Now I'm less concerned about the full shape here, but what I'd like to do is just get a sense of this shape here. So again, I'm going to simplify it into a basic oval shape. And again, just lightly ghost in this shape. So now I've done a very clean divide between the lit side and the shadow side. So all of this is shadow, all of this is going to be light. So let's talk for a few minutes about the actual different kinds of values that we're going to see. So I've said that everything on the right side of our egg here is going to be in shadow, we can actually draw a division between our value scale. So that means everything on the right side is going to be one of these three values, leaving two values for the lit side. So you'll notice that right along the line of termination, the shadow here is a little bit darker than right next to it. Now, whenever you're dealing with values, it can help to see them if you let your eyes go softly out of focus or even squint. I have students who wear glasses who take their glasses off while they're trying to discern values. And the reason that works is because if your eyes are focused, they tend to pick up detail. But we don't want to see detail here. We want to see the general pattern that the light and shadow are creating. So again, if you softly let your eyes go out of focus, you'll see this slightly darker band right across here. That is called the core shadow, and that is going to be our number 4 value. Now, the reason the core shadow exists, the reason we have this darker band here, is because we have the light coming from the left, and we have light not only hitting our object, but it's hitting the surface the object is on and bouncing back up and relighting the base of, of our egg shape here. So what we call this slightly lighter area of the shadow is the reflected light. Now it's important to note that even though this is referred to as reflected light, it's still considered a shadow condition, and reflected light is going to be our number 3 value. Now finally, we get to the cast shadow here. Now the cast shadow, you can see, is the darkest value anywhere on the object. And the cast shadow is the only real place we're going to use the number 5 value. So how this works with the shading process is that I know everything in here is going to be a number 3 value or darker. Now I also mentioned that I rarely attempt to lay in the exact right value the first attempt. So instead what I'm going to do is everything on the shadow side, I'm going to make a number 3. Now when I do this, sometimes the base of our egg can get lost. So I'm going to reinforce the base of our egg just a little bit so we don't lose it when we start to apply our number 3 value. So here I'm giving what is called a wash of value. So you'll note that I'm using the side of my pencil, and I'm laying in value as a simple wash. Now, students are often surprised that this initial value wash is pretty messy, and again, that's totally fine. Remember, a drawing, as you've seen, gets refined over time, so it's perfectly fine to have this initial wash be a little messy. To me, what a drawing does is it slowly almost comes into focus over time. So even if you want a refined drawing at the end, that doesn't mean it has to be refined at every step of the way through. So right along the line of termination, I've started to drop in this number 3 value. And again, even though there's a lot of complexity in the shading here, I've simplified everything down into just a few shapes and a simple lay-in of value. So next, I'm going to render the core shadow, which is again our number 4 value. So to do the core shadow, I'm going to darken right along the line of termination. But you'll note that when I'm doing this, I'm still leaving the line pretty soft. You never want a hard edge on the line of termination on a rounded object. There's always going to be a subtle gradation there. Now you'll also note that the core shadow is darkest right up here. So again, using the side of my pencil, I'm going to drop in a number 4 value. So I'm going to darken this, and it gets a little bit lighter, you'll note, next to the tip of the egg. So roughly, our core shadow value is going to start up at the top as a number 4, but as it gets closer here, it's actually going to move toward a number 3 value. So this is one of the ways that I get a good amount of complexity in shading, but only think in terms of these 5 values, because when I'm transitioning 4 to 3 here, we start to get those subtle gradations in value. Now, again, the shading process is one of a good amount of layering, so I know that I can come back and refine this later. So again, it's okay that it's messy. Now, I also know that the cast shadow here is eventually going to be a number 5 value, but initially, I'm just going to drop it in as a number 4 value, and I'll talk about why that is in just a moment. So instead of dropping all the way to the, down to the bottom of the value scale at the cast shadow, dropping it in as a number 4 first gives me an opportunity to make sure that the drawing is going to work in terms of light and shadow. So what I mean by that is if your drawing is going to read as realistically lit, it should do it by this stage. If the illusion of light and shadow isn't coming through at this stage, you probably need to go back and refine the shapes in the rest of the drawing. But hopefully you can see that this illusion of the light and shadow is already starting to occur, even though I'm only using 3 values. So this should come as a revelation to some of you. One of the common things that happens with when beginners start to do shading is they tend to reward themselves for seeing all of the shadow variations. In reality, you only really need 3 to make it start to read. So I'm going to do just a little bit of refinement here in our egg drawing. Now again, we can refine this as much as we want later on, but now that I know that it's starting to read, I'm actually going to drop the cast shadow closer to a number 5 value. So at this stage, I'm less concerned about keeping a firm edge here on the bottom of the egg, and I'm more concerned about, again, just placing in values that are going to work. So moving over to the lit side, we still have 2 values. Now, one of the suggestions I often make to people is that you want to make sure your values in the shadow side are reading before you start to place in any sort of lighting on the lit side. And the reason is, you'll note that the drawing starts to work with only our shadow values in place. These are the essential values. The core shadow value, number 4, the reflected light, number 3, and the cast shadow value, number 5, are really all your brain needs to have the object be believably lit on the page. But once those are starting to work, dealing with the light can be a wonderful way to add a lot of vitality and beauty to the drawing. So whenever I'm preparing to put white pencil into a drawing, one of the very first things that I will do is clean up the lit side with an eraser. So I tend not to use erasers for mistake correction so much as for cleanup. I don't want any of the pigment of my pencil to get in the area where we're going to apply the white. If you do have leftover pigment there, what tends to happen is it creates a kind of mud, and we don't want that. And it's difficult to get rid of once you create that mud. So again, I'm going to just do a little bit more refinement on the shadow side. And again, I can come back and do this more of this kind of refinement a little later. So now we're going to use the white pencil to place in the highlight. So you can see here we have this bright highlight at the tip of the egg where the light is reflecting off of the object and going right back into the viewer's eyes. So I'm going to place this highlight here. But you'll also note that we're getting a good amount of light here, and the object tends to dim just a little bit as it goes back. So I'm going to use the white pencil first just in a pretty basic wash and let it get a little lighter as it goes back. And again, you'll see I'm not simply trying to capture all of the value right at the beginning. I'm slowly laying in the white pencil just like I did with our other values. Because again, I want to give the object a chance to build up its values. So you're going to see me go through this entire process in the figure, but I thought it was important to simplify it down in just a basic form first so you can really get a sense of it. Now I'm going to take quite a bit more time to give a more detailed shading treatment to the figure that we're drawing here. But again, I think it's important that you see this process unfold on a basic object. And the idea is that once you can do it on a basic object like this, you'll be much more prepared to attempt to do this kind of shading process on the far more complex forms of the figure. So now I'm going to apply the exact same process that you saw me do on the egg to the figure. So the first step is to apply the line of termination. So take a look at the reference photo here. You can see that there's an exact moment where the figure goes from light to shadow. And so it's a much more complex line than the one we saw on the egg, but we can actually follow this shadow shape all the way from the arm, down the shoulder, down the back. We get some serrated edges here, down the side of the figure here, down to the pelvis, all the way down the leg to the knee, and all the way through the foot. So you can see, similar to our egg, almost all of the shadows are on the right side, where almost all of the light is on the left side. So when I first block in the line of termination, it's going to be pretty simple. I'm not trying to capture all of the detail at first. And again, I'm going to do it first pretty lightly, just using the side of my pencil. And I just want to arrive at the basic shape. Now remember, I can always come back and refine this. So the idea isn't that I'm capturing it perfectly the first time, but I do want to give my best first attempt. So on these kinds of serrated edges, sometimes I try and capture the serrations, other times I'll come back, but I think I'm going to lay them in with this one. Down the external oblique, to the pelvis, we have a cut here, and then we can go down the leg. So again, I'm simply finding a clean division between the lit side of the figure and the shadow side of the figure. Now remember, we talked about focus a little bit. So again, if I'm not interested in drawing a certain section, we talked about this back leg as just dropping behind the rest of the figure. So I'm not going to give that as much attention. Now, technically, the bra section here is not in shadow, but it is a dark value. So I'm actually going to think about it in relationship to the rest of our value shapes. So the last shadow condition we can start to render here is the cast shadow. So you can see this arm is casting a shadow both across the breasts as well as up and over the arm. So I'm going to block that in as well, and again, initially first, just as a simple shape. So we've got that there. And on this back arm, we can see a shadow running up to the armpit. And of course, we can see the cast shadow going up and then around the back side of the arm. And again, because that arm is a little behind, I might want to drop that back as well. So now that I've figured out where all of the shadow shapes are with the line of termination, I can drop in our reflected light value. That is the lightest of our shadow values. And remember, we're going to build up to our darker values. So again, using the side of my pencil, I'm going to unify all of the shadows into a simple wash of value. And again, I'm ignoring all of the variations in shadow here and simply unifying everything together. And I'm also going to block in the shadow again. I'm sorry, this isn't shadow, but I'm going to block in this darker value of the bra here, as well as the underwear here. Now I'm going to go in again and get these values on the arms, as well as the cast shadow values. So again, at first, we are doing the simplest possible conception of our values. Now, I really like this stage of the drawing because for me, this is where it starts to really come into its own and start to describe the figure in a much more interesting and complex way than what we initially had. So now that I have my reflected light value blocked in, I want to start to walk down the value scale. So now I'm going to attempt to do our core shadow, or number 4 value. So just like on the egg that we saw, you can see that we have this dark band of light that runs down the body, and directly to the right of it, you can see it actually gets lighter next to the edge. So that is the core shadow going and transitioning into the reflected light. So we've essentially already placed the reflected light in our drawing, so now we need to pull out the core shadow. Now again, we're going to go through a refinement stage in the drawing a little later on, so we don't have to come up with all of the shadow details yet. But this core shadow is going to separate itself from the reflected light. And in the reference photo, you can even see in some of these areas that we do have a really slender core shadow, and it does get just a little lighter right next to the edge of the form. And particularly in some of these areas, we can have the core shadow. We really see the separation between the core shadow and the reflected light. Even on these small details where we have the serratus muscles attaching to the ribs, we can see that effect going on. And again, we have an incredibly slender core shadow here with it getting slightly lighter right next to it. And on the leg, we have a really wonderful transition from the core shadow to the reflected light. So again, you can see this nice long core shadow here, and again, the form getting a little lighter next to the edge. And again, this is a very simplified version of the core shadow. We're going to come back and do quite a bit of refinement in a little bit. Once again, going down the leg, you can see the core shadow here with the reflected light getting a little bit lighter next to the edge. One of the reasons that we spent so much time with the egg rendering those shadows is because you can see that all of the shadow conditions that are found on the figure can be simplified into something really basic like the egg. And so if you can understand them there, you can really start to understand all of the values on the figure. So next, now that our core shadow is working, we're going to drop down to our number 5 value, or the cast shadow value. And remember, that's your darkest value. Now we don't find that value in too many places. You can see it here in the armpit. We have a really dark cast shadow. We can see again that darker value, although it doesn't go quite all the way to a 5 here. You can see a little bit of the darker value in here in the other armpit. But for the most part, we're dealing mostly with the core shadow. But watch how when I apply this dark area of the cast shadow to this area like the armpit, watch how much this tends to pop it out. So again, I'm actually applying it a little more delicately. I might not drop all the way to 5 on the first try. And cast shadows do tend to get a little bit lighter as they go. But having that number 5 value in the armpit, as well as a couple of overlaps, really goes a long way in helping describe what that form is doing. And again, in the other armpit as well, it's going to get a little bit darker here. We can actually see some of the overlaps of the musculature happening in the armpit as well that we're going to pull out. And of course, right over here, I'm going to darken this up. And again, cast shadows get lighter the further away they get from the part of the objects that is casting them. So I'm going to take just a few minutes now and again start to refine a little bit of the core shadow. So I'm going around now and just taking a look at where the shadows are, and making sure on another pass that they are reflecting the actual form that we're drawing. Also going to drop in this darker area for the underwear here. Okay, so hopefully at this stage you can really start to see the light and shadow of the figure really starting to describe the form. And again, it's in a pretty general way at this stage, but the lighting patterns are cohesive enough where they start to make a good amount of sense to the viewer. The shading process can take a good amount of time, so I have continued to make some refinements in the shadows, but once you're at a point where you're comfortable, you understand the shadows and they're starting to work, you can move over to the lit side of the body. Now you'll notice here that I'm working on toned paper. So the trick to adding light is to use a white pencil for the highlights, but to let the paper do as much work as possible. Now, whenever you're going to add white pencil, the very first thing you want to do is to take an eraser and clean up any area that you're going to see white pencil. So once again, the reason is that if you have any of the darker pigment where you want to apply white, it'll get in the white. White is an incredibly delicate color. And so we want to lift as much of any stray pigment, whether they're processed lines or whether they've been smeared from my hand or anything else, we want to lift away as much as possible. So I would say that this part of the process of removing pigment before we actually apply white pencil is probably one of the most often skipped steps. People love to go right in with the white pencil, but again, it usually doesn't work out too well. This is also an opportunity just to clean up any measuring lines or anything else that you don't necessarily want seen by a viewer, although I actually prefer a lot of those mistakes, missteps, and first attempts to be left on the page. I think they actually add a lot of texture and dynamism to the final drawing. So one of the things you'll notice that I'm doing is when I'm using the kneaded eraser to it, I can actually shape the tip of it just a little bit. And really a kneaded eraser should be used more like silly putty rather than a tool to scrub away pigment. So in areas like this right above the bra, the light on the breast is this really thin segment. So I can actually shape the kneaded eraser into roughly that shape so I can get in there and remove any pigment. You can see that's quite a bit cleaner now. And when you get too much pigment on the surface of your kneaded eraser, just like silly putty, you pull it until you get a clean spot, and then you can continue to lift. So once you're ready, once you feel like you've got enough of the pigment off, you're ready to apply the white pencil. So one of the first things I like to do is figure out where some of the brighter moments on the figure are so I can really focus the white there. Also, this is another opportunity to decide to add emphasis to certain areas. So for example, if I didn't want to draw a lot of attention to the hand over here, even though it's one of the brighter areas, I don't have to pull light over there. So I really like the shoulder, this upper arm here, the leg, and I really like the torso. So I think I want to focus most of my light there. So I'm going to go in with, actually I'm seeing a little more pigment there, so let me lighten this up a little more. And actually, one trick that I often use is if I'm going to have an area with a lot of white pencil, you can remove the contour lines entirely, or almost entirely, and really let the light define the edge. So I'm going to come in with a white pencil and just start to pull out some of the lit areas here. Now again, just like the shadow, I'm not immediately attempting to capture all of the complexity of the values or the intensity of the values in my first pass. I want to build up to them. The other thing I would recommend, just like with the shadows, is moving around the entire form. So we're not localizing our drawing in any one location. We can move all over the form and start to pull in the light. So here at the abdominal column, we can start to render both of the abdominal columns here. This little pad of flesh here. Now, one thing that people are often tempted to do is if they see a darker area like this, or say here right on the inside of the left leg, you see it definitely gets a little darker. Now, many people are tempted to pull out their pencil and actually put shadow there. But again, the trick with the white pencil is to let the paper do a lot of that work for you. So instead of laying in any pigment there, I'm simply going to place a lot of white on the outside edge of the leg here, but let the paper be the value instead of the pencil adding darkness there. So you can see we can arrive at that similar subtle transition from light to dark by having the paper show through the white pencil and eventually just getting to the paper itself. Now, one of the things that's common is even though I've gone around and started to clean up a lot of these areas, I'm still going to find areas that I want to apply white pencil that still need a little more cleaning up. So again, you want to feel like you're working back and forth through a lot of these processes. So I really like all the bright light on this leg, so I'm really going to emphasize it. And because the leg is partially an egg shape, but really a cylinder, we can see a nice bright highlight kind of moving up in this direction. Now, one of the things I'm going to do with this shape is I'm actually going to use the cross contour we had initially talked about. So if I imagine there was a grid going around this form, and remember we talked about that overlap here earlier, I'm actually going to apply the light in the direction that that mesh grid would go. And again, this is just another subtle indication to the brain that this is a cylindrical form. Now, because it would be coming up and over this way, over here when I apply the light, I'm going to have the strokes go this way. So again, this is a subtle indication to the viewer, telling them what direction the volume is moving. So again, we have a number of muscular details underneath here. And again, I'm going to try and let the paper do a lot of the work. So instead of adding any shading in these areas, I'm going to use the white pencil to pull it up. Now I can tell here in some of these areas that I still have some black pigment down. So you can see the white pencil when it's placed on isn't quite as bright. So what I'm going to do is try and lift out the white pencil I've placed in here and hopefully bring some of the stray pigment with it. Once again, I'm going to shape my tool into a nice little shape of the light here so I can pull this out. And I'm going to go back in and start to reapply some of the lighting. Underneath here as well. So you'll note that I'm starting to work with a number of pretty subtle details at this stage. And you'll note that the white pencil starts to interact with the darker pencil to describe the form. So for example, if you see in the reference photo, we have this rib here and the connection to the serratus muscles acts as a cylinder. We have a lit side, core shadow, and then a little bit of reflected light. So the shadow and the reflected light are of course handled with the dark pencil, but now we can come in with the light pencil and start to get in the lit side of that. So the further you go with the white pencil, the more detailed you can start to get with these forms. So you can start to see now some of the individual abdominal muscles starting to come out. And again, it's pretty subtle, but it is starting to come out. You can get some of the muscular connections of the external obliques. Here, the belly of the external oblique. Again, we can pull that form out quite a bit more. And this is another form that actually is pretty similar to our egg, where we have our highlight, core shadow, reflected light. So this process of adding light onto the figure, again, can take a pretty long time, but hopefully you can really start to see all of the different values working together to really start to describe and render the form. So I'm going to be working back and forth between light and shadow, as well as line quality, to really start to pull out these forms. But remember, you want the drawing to start working as a whole with all of the values coming together to describe form before you go in and start doing any kind of refinement. At this stage, the drawing is really starting to pull together. I can really see a separation between the lights and darks. The forms seem to be really coming out of the drawing. But it still has a roughness to me. So the last stage of the drawing, I tend to go back and forth between all of the processes we've talked about thus far to really refine the drawing. So I'll go back to line quality, I'll work back and forth from light to shadow, and at times I may even decide to redraw something, regesture something, and if I catch something way off, I might even remeasure. Now, the refinement stage also requires that we make some decisions about what kind of drawing that we want to do. Now, a lot of people define a finished drawing by all of the different parts of the drawing being brought up to the same level of rendering, but I kind of like to make decisions of where I want to focus. So for example, I don't think I want to deal with portraiture in this drawing so much. I'm really loving the arm and the torso and really this leg coming down here. So this is the area that I'm really interested in rendering. Now what that means is I can let the hand, the back leg, the feet, and even the head drop back a little bit. So I'm going to do a little work on all of these areas, but I'm not going to render them nearly as much as I'm going to render the rest of the form. So I'm going to come in and do just a little bit of sculpting of the facial features. And again, I'm just blocking this in extremely lightly. So I'm not interested in doing a full rendered version. And I'm going to pay particular focus to where we have the highest contrast, which would of course be in the hair. So I'm going to shape the hair and the head just a little bit more. And of course, I can place the bun on the top. And instead of, again, really rendering these, I'm simply going to add a basic wash of value. And I may add just a hint of subtle shadowing in the hair. So you can see what this does is it immediately allows us to see that there is a head there, and there's even an implication of a face here, but it's allowed to drop into the background, so we really don't need to add a huge amount of emphasis to it. So remember, it's up to you as an artist to decide how much information you want to give the viewer at any stage of the drawing. I also might want to pull this foot up just a little bit more, and again, I don't want to draw too much attention to it, but I do want to shape it just a little bit. So again, I'm going to give it just a little more dimensionality here. So I want the viewer to register that it is there, but I don't want to really call much attention to it. Now, if I do want to really pull up the forms in the shoulders and in the torso, I'm going to have to add quite a bit more light to it. So once again, I'm going to go in and clean these areas up. And this is pretty common. There's going to be a lot of back and forth between adding white, cleaning up the drawing, adding some more white. So I'm really going to start to pull this area up into a much brighter level of light here. So you can see here at the wrist that the arm here is almost like a box. So we can see that this plane of the box is working in this direction here, whereas the top section is moving in a slightly different direction. Now, I'm not strictly using the cross contour to render all of the light and shadow. It's just something I'm occasionally doing, again, if I want to work with the volume a little more. So the more passes you tend to make with the white pencil, the more it tends to soften the passes. The individual lines end up being a little less visible, and they give way to, again, simply patches of light. And if you want to add a little more softness, you can, of course, always come in with the side of the pencil if you do want to unify things just a little bit more. So this is a great way to start to soften up some of these lit areas if you want to. Now, the level of crispness in your lines is really up to you. Some people really prefer to leave really sharp hatch marks. Some people like to soften things up either by using the side of the pencil or occasionally even by smudging things. Now, all of those are stylistic decisions that really are up to you as an artist and are really going to define the look and the style of the drawing you're working with. So here, once again, you can see I found a little bit of extra black pencil in there. And if you're not sure, you'll see it in the white pencil. So again, what I tend to do if I find it in there is blot it out. And every new time I visit one of these areas, I take the opportunity to really check for more detail. And again, every new pass, I usually see something that I've missed in the previous passes. That's why it's so important to work back and forth across the drawing to make sure that you're giving yourself as much opportunity as possible to pick up any information that you may have previously missed. So if I feel that there's getting to be a little too much sharpness in some of these areas, as you can see in the reference photograph, it's not nearly as delineated as I've drawn it here. One of the things I do is just give a wash of light, again, to kind of unify all of these areas together. And again, you can see that softens everything and pulls everything together. And you can always pull the light back out of it if you want to pull it back up and back into focus. So one of the things you'll see me doing here is I'm not attempting to replicate the same value scheme I'm seeing here. I'm not chasing around the lights and the darks from the photographs. I'm making decisions to emphasize certain aspects of the anatomy or the form based on really my interest level in them. So again, you don't want to tether yourself to to feeling like you can only draw what you've observed. We're always making decisions as artists that are going to allow us to really show the viewer what we as artists are interested in. And in fact, I think that's a great way to kind of think about your style and what you want to pull out of these drawings as an artist is, what spots are you most interested in? What spots do you look at that you think are the most interesting? And the real reason to draw it, in addition to learning about it, is to just feel like you can share what you find interesting about your subject with a viewer. So one of my favorite moments in this drawing is right here. We have a lot of light coming in here, and so I'm really going to pull the lights up on this edge of the leg. So this refinement process is really an opportunity, again, to work back and forth. And the more time you spend with your subject, the more information you'll notice about it, and really the more opportunities you'll find for refinement. So what usually happens at this stage of the drawing is I will often take a break from it for hours or often even days and come back to it and just see what I notice, see what's different, see what strikes me as interesting, or to see just what information that I may have missed in my initial attempts at the forms. And I'm always surprised to see pretty obvious pieces of information that I missed the first couple of times. So you want to think of this refinement process as really lasting as long as you need it to. And in fact, I've heard that many artists will have the same drawing or painting up in their studios for months that they continue to go back to and continue to work on and refine. So you can see, because we have so much light on this leg, I'm actually relying less on the paper to do a lot of the work. And you can see now that I'm coming back around to this side, the direction of my lines has actually switched. So we can, again, really subtly imply that sense of the form going up and around. So in addition to a lot of the subtle information, of course, I can still go back in with line quality as well. So in some of these areas, I might want to come in and start to add in some of the really subtle anatomical details that we're seeing. Regarding human anatomy, I would encourage people to really study the body if they want to get good at figure drawing. Studying anatomy is a really essential component to this process, and it's something that I'm thinking about constantly throughout this entire figure drawing process. And it allows you to even notice some of these small anatomical details that might otherwise go unnoticed or might not make as much sense to you as an artist. So again, for subtle things like you can see the overlap right here of the front of the leg in front of the gastrocnemius, or the calf muscle behind. So a lot of those little details you're unlikely to even notice if you haven't had some anatomical training. But once you are a little more comfortable in anatomy, you'll tend to find far more opportunities to communicate to the viewer all of these dimensional forms. So once again, this process of refinement can go on for quite some time. But I would encourage you to do it. I would encourage you to give yourself enough time where you can come back to the work and really ask yourself, where do you want the focus to be? What do you want to accentuate in this drawing? And what kinds of details and information can you let just go by the wayside? So it's only through giving yourself a lot of time, distance, and really observing and spending time comparing your subject back and forth that you can really refine a drawing and get it to a place that it's really exemplifying what you're interested in as an artist. So now that you've seen this drawing go through its process, I want to talk about how this process applies to a few different kinds of drawings. So you can see each one of these drawings was done on a different color paper, and they also each took a different amount of time. So the drawing here was about a 20-minute drawing. This one you just saw was about an hour or so, and this drawing was somewhere between 2 to 3 hours. So you'll notice in the 20-minute drawing, I actually did almost no mark making in the lit side of the figure, and I focused almost entirely on the shadow side of the figure. This drawing also has a brevity to it that I think really plays nicely. It focuses much more on the gesture, and I think it looks like it was drawn more quickly. So I think drawings like this, even though they're shorter and less detailed, really have a dynamic elegance to them that in some ways I even enjoy more than a fully rendered figure. So you can see in a number of locations here the focus on the simple volumes. So you can see here an indication of a cylinder. You can see here an indication of an ovoid shape. There's also a lot of great line quality coming through here. So you can see in overlaps and using darker lines to really pull the legs forward and really add emphasis again to the torso and the legs while letting the back arm and the foot kind of fall to the background. So this drawing here is the longest of the three. So this took, again, roughly 2 to 3 hours. And there are a few important differences that I wanted to show you. So the first thing I wanted to point out is that you can see I've left a lot of process lines on this drawing. If you take a look up here by the arm, you can see numerous attempts at the arm. Now, a lot of people have an urge to knock those lines back or to erase them. And I really like to leave them in the drawing for a couple of reasons. I think they add a sense of dynamism and almost a kinetic sense to the drawing. It almost looks like it's in mid-motion. Now in reality, of course, these are just my early attempts to capture the form, but I think they add this sense of time and motion to the drawing that would be lost if we obscured them. Now, in the drawing that you saw me work on today, I tend to let the head and the hands go out of focus a little bit, but here you can see the head and the hands play a more prominent role. And the areas that got left behind are, again, this arm in the back and this leg in the back. They're less finished, so they tend to recede a little, whereas the hand, the head, this hand here, and particularly the legs and the feet play a much more prominent role. So I've actually done quite a bit of rendering in the hair. You can also see that this drawing uses far more cross-hatching and a little less tonal shading. So if you look closely, you can see thousands of individual little lines that work together to form, to render all of this light and shadow here. So it's a bit more of a refined work, but again, I'm still leaving a huge amount of process. And there are certain areas that you see the contours almost entirely disappear. So hopefully seeing this process unfold has demystified what it takes to draw the figure. So I've gone through a number of different strategies that I'm hoping are make the figure drawing process accessible to you. So if you've wanted to draw the figure, but you've been hesitant because you think it's too hard, now you have a whole series of tools to apply. So I would encourage you to get started practicing right away.